The morning after the funeral, the great hall at Ashbourne Court smelled of wet wool and snuffed candles, and Eleanor Frost stood at the foot of the staircase, holding a folded square of paper she had not been given leave to hold. The mourners had not yet gone. Carriages still waited in the drive, their horses steaming in the cold, and the black crape over the long windows turned the December light to the color of ash. She was a servant in this house, a girl who lit fires and carried trays and was not spoken to, and she had learned in 3 years of service exactly how invisible a quiet woman could be made to feel in a room full of people who outranked her. She kept her eyes down. She kept her hands still. The paper inside her glove was warm where her thumb pressed it, and it carried a weight that had nothing to do with its size. At the top of the stairs, a man came to a stop. He was tall, dressed in the deep black of deepest mourning, and he held himself with the kind of stillness that other people mistook for coldness because they had never seen what it cost him. This was the new master of Ashbourne, arrived from London 2 days too late to say goodbye to the brother. He had buried that morning. He did not look at the servants. He looked at the room the way a man looks at a debt he intends to pay, and when his gaze passed over the girl at the foot of the stairs, it did not stop, and she told herself she was glad of it. To the house, she was nothing. A pair of hands, a shape that moved through the corridors before dawn, and was gone again before the family woke. The housekeeper called her capable when she wished to be, kind and slow when she did not, and the other servants called her the quiet one, which was meant as neither praise nor insult, but only as a fact, the way one might note that a chair was brown. No one in that hall knew that the folded paper in her glove was the last thing the dead man had pressed into her hands. 3 nights before he died, with his fingers shaking and his voice gone to a whisper. No one knew he had said, "When you are ready," and not before. Give it only to the one who asks the right question. She did not know yet what he had meant. She only knew she had promised, and she was a woman who kept her promises even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Stay with her a moment, because the world is about to decide it has no use for her, and the world is about to be wrong. Eleanor had come to Ashbourne Court at 21, in the worst winter of her life, with a single trunk and a letter of character that was honest and therefore brief. Her father had been a country curate, a gentle scholar who taught her Latin and Greek and the names of every plant in the hedgerows, and who left her, when he died, with nothing but books and the manners of a class she could no longer afford to belong to. She had buried him in a parish churchyard with frost on the spade. She had sold the books one at a time through that first year, the Virgil last of all, and when the books were gone, she had taken the only position a gentlewoman, without a fortune, could take without shame, which was to pretend she had never been a gentlewoman at all. She wore the plain gray stuff gown of an upper housemaid. She tied back her dark hair under a plain cap. She let the house believe she was simple, because simple women were left alone, and being left alone was the nearest thing to safety she had found. The dead master had seen through it. Edmund, the elder brother, the man they had buried that morning, had come upon her one evening in the library where she had no business, being a book open in her lap, and tears standing in her eyes over a passage of Greek she had not read since her father taught it to her. A lesser man would have dismissed her on the spot. He had instead sat down across from her, an invalid wrapped in shawls, his lungs already failing him, and asked her quietly to translate the passage aloud. She had, and to pee. He had listened with his eyes closed. After that he had asked for her by name on the evenings. The pain was bad, and she had read to him, Greek and Latin and sometimes only the newspaper, and he had treated her not as a servant, but as the educated woman she had buried, along with her father. It had been the one kindness in 3 hard years. Now he was dead, and the kindness was a folded paper in her glove, and a promise she did not yet understand. The mourners left by noon. The house emptied of its borrowed sorrow. And what remained was the family, which was to say, the dowager and her chosen heir, and the long, cold business of inheritance. The dowager was not Edmund's mother, but his aunt by marriage, Lady Margaret Ashbourne, a widow of formidable composure, who had run the household in the years of Edmund's illness and had no intention of surrendering the reins now that he was gone. She moved through the rooms that afternoon, settling the new order with a glance here and a word there, and when she passed Eleanor in the corridor outside the study, she paused, looked her over from cap to hem, and said to the footman beside her, in a voice pitched to carry, that the quiet ones were always the first to be let go, since a house in mourning had no need of a girl who did nothing but light fires and stare. Eleanor curtsied and said nothing. The label landed where it was meant to land, in the soft place under the ribs, and she felt the old heat climb her throat, and she pressed it down the way she had learned to press everything down. Her hand, without her permission, rose to the front of her apron where the paper lay hidden against her stays. She lowered it again before anyone saw. The new master saw. Yeah. He had come out of the study at the sound of his aunt's voice, and he stood in the doorway with a sheaf of his brother's letters in one hand, and he watched the girl's hand rise to her apron and fall again, and something in his still face shifted by a degree so small that no one but the most careful observer would have named it. He did not speak. He looked at her for the length of one breath, longer than a man looks at furniture. Then his aunt said his name, Theodore, and he turned away, and the moment closed over like water over a dropped stone. His name was Theodore Ashbourne, and until 11 days ago he had been merely the younger son, the spare, the brother who had gone for a soldier because the estate would never be his, and a man must do something with his life. He had served in Spain and come home with a limp. He disguised well, and a silence he disguised better. He had not expected to inherit. He had not wanted to. He had wanted his brother to live, and his brother had not lived. And now he was the Duke of Ashbourne, with a great house full of his brother's ghost, and an aunt who watched him the way a chess player watches a piece she means to move. He carried his brother's letters everywhere those first days. He read them at night by a single candle. He was looking for something in them and he did not find it, and the not finding made him colder by the day, and the house decided his coldness was his nature, when it was only his grief, wearing the one coat grief had left him. In the days that followed the funeral, the household reassembled itself around the new master, and Eleanor learned to read him the way she read weather. He rose before light, as she did, and more than once she came into the library at 5 in the morning to lay the fire and found him already there, asleep in the chair, with a letter fallen from his hand and the candle guttered to a stub. The first time it happened, she froze in the doorway, certain she would be blamed for the intrusion. He woke at the small sound of the coal scuttle. He looked at her across the gray room, and she braced for the sharp word. And instead he said only, low and even, "Light it, and go warm yourself in the kitchen. You are blue with cold." It was a command. She did not hear. Not yet. That a man who notices a servant is blue with cold is a man who has been watching her hands. She heard it a little, perhaps. Her body heard it before she did. When he spoke to her, in that level voice, her pulse moved in her throat in a way she could not account for and did not like, and she attended to the fire with more care than the fire required, and she went away to the kitchen as ordered, and stood by the great hearth a long while, telling herself the warmth in her face. The dowager began her campaign that same week. Lady Margaret had a candidate for the new duke, as she had for every eligible man who crossed her path, and the candidate was her late husband's grandniece, Miss Caroline Vane, a young woman of considerable fortune and faultless manners, who arrived at Ashbourne with 3 trunks and a lady's maid, and the settled confidence of a woman who has been told her, whole life, that she is the correct answer to every question. Miss Vane was not unkind. That was the worst of it in a way. She was merely certain, the way the well-placed are certain, that the world was arranged for her convenience, and that the servants who arranged it were a kind of furniture that happened to move. She would hand Eleanor her gloves without looking at her. She would speak of her, over her head. And in the drawing room in the evenings, where Eleanor came to mend the fire, she would lean toward the Duke and make her small, bright observations, and the Dowager would watch them both, with the satisfaction of a general whose lines are holding. Eleanor watched too, from the edges where she lived. She told herself it was nothing to her whom the Duke married. She told herself this with great firmness, kneeling at the hearth with the brush in her hand, while across the room he answered Miss Vane in his short, level sentences, and did not once, that Eleanor could see, look at the young lady the way a man looks at a woman he intends to choose. He looked instead when he thought no one observed him. At the door through which the servants came and went, Eleanor did not let herself notice this. She noticed it anyway, in her body where the truth lived, and she carried the noticing down to the kitchen, and could not put it down. It was a child who first cracked the surface of the house. Edmund had left behind a ward, a boy of 7 named Henry, the orphaned son of a fellow officer whom the elder brother had taken in 2 years before and loved as his own. Henry had stopped speaking after the funeral. He would not eat at the nursery table. He sat at the window of the long gallery with his face to the glass, and the nursemaid wrung her hands, and the Dowager said the boy was being difficult and ought to be sent to school in the spring to be made sensible. The Duke did not know what to do with him. He had buried so many men in Spain that he had forgotten, if he had ever known, how to comfort a living child, and his attempts were stiff and short and frightened the boy worse. Eleanor found the boy in the gallery on the 3rd evening in the blue dark, before the lamps were lit. He was small for 7, and he had drawn his knees up to his chin on the broad window seat, and his breath had fogged a little patch of the cold glass that he was not bothering to wipe clear. She had come to draw the curtains and lay the fire. She set down her things without a sound. She did not try to make him speak, because she remembered being a child in a cold house with a grief too large for her body, and being asked over and over by well-meaning people to say how she felt, and she remembered how the asking had made it worse. So she did the only thing she had ever wanted anyone to do for her. She sat down on the floor beside him, which no servant should do, her gray skirts pooling on the boards, and she looked out the window at the same nothing he was looking at. The gray grounds, and the bare elms, and the low sky, and she let the silence be a thing they shared rather than a thing she meant to break. A long while passed. The light failed by degrees. Then she began, very quietly, almost as though she were speaking to herself, to tell him the story her father had told her the winter her mother died. It was a story about a boy who found a fallen star in a field one night, still warm, and put it in his pocket, and would not show it to anyone, not his mother, nor his friends, nor the king who sent men to look for it, because he was afraid that if he opened his hand to the air the light would go out, and he would be left holding nothing but a cold stone. And the memory of brightness, she told it slowly. She did not look at Henry while she told it. She looked at the snow that had begun, just then to come down beyond the glass, the first fat flakes of it drifting past the dark elms. She told how the boy carried the star until his hand ached, and how he grew thin and quiet from the carrying, and how one day a girl sat down beside him and did not ask to see what he held, and only sat. And after a long time the boy found that he could open his hand a little, in the dark, where it was safe. It had been waiting to be let breathe. When she finished, the boy was leaning against her arm, his weight gone soft and trusting against her sleeve, and his small cold hand had crept into the pocket of her apron and closed there, and she let it stay. And she did not know that the Duke stood in the dark doorway behind them, and had heard the whole of it. He had come looking for the boy. He had stopped at the threshold when he saw them. And he stood there in the blue dark, and watched the servant girl. The world had called slow and simple, sit on the floor in her plain gray gown, and reach a grieving child no one else in the house could reach. And he did not move, until she had finished. And then he went away as silently as he had come. And that night he did not read his brother's letters at all. The witnessing changed him in ways the house could not see, and Eleanor could not imagine. he began to find reasons to be where she was. He asked the housekeeper, with elaborate carelessness, which of the maids had charge of the library fires, and was told it was the quiet one, Frost, and he said nothing and remembered it. He came down early and found her there, and did not send her away. He learned that she read the books while she dusted them, that she put them back exactly as she found them, that she had a particular care for the Greek shelf that no one had asked her to give it. One gray morning he took down the Sophocles and opened it to a passage and set it on the table near where she worked, and said, without looking at her, that he had never managed the Greek as a boy, and his tutors had despaired of him, and he wondered idly whether the lines meant anything, or were only noise. It was not idle. It was the most careful thing he had ever done. He was giving her a door, and pretending it was a draught. She knew she should not walk through it. A servant who revealed herself was a servant who could be dismissed for insolence, for stepping above her station, for being other than she had agreed to be. The whole architecture of her safety these 3 years had rested on the house believing her simple, and here was the master of it holding a door open and waiting. And the waiting itself was a danger she had no defense against. She looked at the book a long moment. The Greek letters swam and then steadied. She thought of her father in his study with the lamp low, correcting her accents with infinite patience, and she thought that he had not taught her the language, so that she might pretend, forever, that she had never learned it. So she set down her cloth. She crossed to the table, and she read him the passage in the original, the long vowels, and the falling cadences her father had loved, and then she translated it, her voice low and steady, and entirely without the flattened simplicity she wore like a second apron, giving him not only the sense of the lines, but the grief beneath them, the old human grief of a man pleading with the dead to stay a moment longer. When she finished, there was a silence in the library that neither of them seemed able to break. The fire ticked in the grate. He looked at her then, fully for the first time, the way he had looked at the door, all those evenings, and she made herself meet it, and she felt the look on her skin like the heat of a fire she stood too near, a warmth that climbed her throat and would not be pressed down. Neither of them said the thing that hung in the air between the shelves. He said only after a while, his voice rougher than its custom, that his brother had been right about her, and he took up the book and left the room before she could ask what he meant. And she stood among the dust and the leather spines, with her heart unquiet and her careful disguise lying in pieces at her feet. You will have guessed already what the house had not. Stay close. The paper is still in her glove. The right question has not yet been asked. The midpoint of any grief is the place where it stops being a wound and becomes a fact you carry. And Theodore reached that place alone late in the study, on the night he finally found what he had been searching for in his brother's letters and discovered it was not there. He had been looking for forgiveness. That was the wound, the thing the house read as coldness, the reason he carried the letters like a man carrying water in his hands. 3 years before, when Edmund first fell ill, Theodore had been in Spain, and Edmund had written asking him to come home, and Theodore had not come. He had told himself the war needed him. He had told himself his brother would recover. He had told himself 100 reasonable things, and his brother had grown sicker through them all, and by the time Theodore sold his commission and came home, the lungs were too far gone, and the brother he loved had 2 years left of breathing and a great deal to forgive. They had never spoken of it. Edmund had been kindness itself, and the kindness had been worse than blame, and Theodore had spent the years since trying to earn a pardon from a man too generous to issue one. And now the man was dead, and the pardon would never come. And that, precisely that. He pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes in the empty study. He had no one to tell. A duke has no equals in his own house. And he had buried his only brother, and the loneliness of it was a physical thing, a pressure behind the breastbone. And down the corridor, because the study fire had been let burn low, and someone had to tend it. Eleanor came in with her scuttle and stopped when she saw him, and saw in the single candle's light what no one else in the house had been permitted to see, which was the new duke with his face in his hands and his shoulders not quite steady. She should have withdrawn. Instead, She set down the scuttle, and she crossed the room, and she did the thing her father would have done, which was to kneel and build up the fire, so the man would not have to sit in the cold while he grieved, and to do it slowly, and to say nothing at all, so that he might gather himself in privacy while pretending the privacy was real. When the fire had caught, she did not rise at once. She said, "To the flames and not to him," in the plain, honest voice she had read the Greek in, that the dead did not ask to be carried, and that the living carried them anyway, and that she did not think love had ever once required forgiveness, because the two had never been the same thing. Then she rose, and took up her scuttle, and went to the door. He spoke her name before she reached it. Not Frost. Not the quiet one. Eleanor. She stopped with her hand on the frame. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. She went out into the corridor and stood a moment in the dark, with her heart going like a struck bell. And she understood, with the part of her that had always known, that she was in a great deal of danger, and that none of it was the kind a servant fears. After that night, the distance between them was a fiction they both maintained, and neither believed. He commanded her in the old way. Sit, eat, rest. You have been on your feet since 4, and she obeyed in the old way, and underneath the commands ran a current that the dowager, who missed very little, did not entirely miss. Lady Margaret watched the Duke decline to look at Miss Vane across the dinner table, and she watched him glance once, very briefly, at the maid, replenishing the side dishes, and she drew her conclusions and laid her plans. She had not protected the order of the house for 30 years to see it overturned by a curate's daughter in a grey gown. She spoke to the housekeeper. She made certain remarks within Eleanor's hearing. In the public space of the morning room this time before Miss Vane and 2 callers, observing pleasantly that a great house attracted a certain kind of woman who mistook a gentleman's courtesy for interest, and that such women were best removed before they made themselves ridiculous, since a scheming servant who set her cap at her master was the oldest and most pitiable story in England. The callers tittered. Miss Vane looked at her gloves. Eleanor, refilling the teapot, kept her hand steady through an act of will that cost her everything she had, and set the pot down without a rattle, and curtsied and withdrew, and did not let the house see her face until she was 3 corridors away. The dowager moved faster than Eleanor could have guessed. Within the week, a thing was discovered to be missing from the late Duke's effects, a small enameled snuff-box of no great value, and the housekeeper was instructed to search the servants' quarters, and the snuff-box was found. Of course it was found, wrapped in a stocking at the bottom of Eleanor's trunk where Eleanor had never put it. She knew at once what it was. She had been a servant long enough to know how a girl was got rid of when the lady of the house wished her gone and could not say why. Theft was the clean way. Theft needed no explanation and left no stain on the accuser. She stood in the cold little room under the eaves with the housekeeper's face gone hard and unhappy, and she did not weep and she did not beg, because she had learned that neither did any good, and she asked only, quietly, to be allowed to gather her father's letters before she went. They brought her down to the great hall to face the family before she was turned out, because the dowager wished it done publicly, as a lesson to the other servants and a closing of the matter beyond appeal. It was the same hall where she had stood the morning after. The funeral. The same black-draped windows, though the crape was coming down now, panel by panel, so that bars of cold December light fell across the stone floor where she was made to stand. The dowager sat in state by the cold hearth with Miss Vane beside her, and 2 footmen at the door, and the housekeeper held the wretched snuff-box on a tray as evidence, her own face unhappy, and turned away. For she had searched the trunk and found the thing too neatly placed, and had said nothing because saying things was not what kept a housekeeper in her position. Eleanor stood in the center of the stone floor in her traveling cloak with her father's letters in a bundle under her arm and her chin level and her eyes dry. Above her the great staircase climbed into shadow. Somewhere above, she knew, the boy Henry would be at his window, and she had not been permitted to say goodbye to him, and that was the one thing that threatened her composure, the thought of the child waiting at the glass for a story that would not come. The dowager pronounced the verdict in her polished, technically courteous voice. the voice that had ordered 30 years of dinners and dismissals with the same even temperature. "A thief," she said, "and a clever one, who had imposed upon the kindness of a dying man, and thought to impose upon his heir, who had worn a false meekness as other women wore false jewels, and who would leave Ashbourne within the hour and consider herself fortunate not to be given over to the magistrate at the next assizes." She let the word magistrate sit in the cold air a moment, so that everyone might feel its edge. There it was, the label a third time, in the place it was always going to be spoken. The scheming servant, the impostor, said now a settled fact before witnesses, with the law held over her head like a raised hand and the whole arranged audience waiting to see the quiet one weep. And Eleanor, who had kept every promise she had ever made, reached into the bodice of her gown where the folded paper had lain against her heart for 11 days, and she did not produce it. Not yet, because she had been told to give it only to the one who asked the right question, and the right question had not been asked. She held it in her closed hand at her side. She looked at the dowager and said, in the clear, unservant voice that made Miss Vane's head turn sharply, that she had taken nothing from this house that was not freely given, and that the late Duke had given her one thing, with his own hands, and had bid her keep it until the right person asked for it, and that she would carry it out the door with her, if no one in this hall had the wit to ask what it was. The hall went very still. Theodore had been standing at the foot of the staircase through all of it, where she had stood 11 days before, and he had not spoken because he had been watching her face the way he had watched it across the gray library, and he had known with a certainty that needed no evidence that the woman before him had stolen nothing in her life. Now he crossed the stone floor. He did not hurry. He crossed it in the unhurried way of a man who has decided something and means to act on it in front of every person whose opinion the world said should matter to him, and he stopped before her closer than a duke stands to a maid, and he looked down into her steady face, and he asked the question. Not what is it? Not what did my brother give you? He asked, low and level and entirely certain, the only question that was the right one. He asked her to tell him what his brother had wished him to know. Her hand opened. The paper lay on her palm, folded small, worn soft at the creases from 11 days against her heart. She did not give it to the dowager. She did not give it to the law. She placed it in the Duke's hand, and he unfolded it, there in the silent hall, and he read it. And the house watched his still face and saw it change. It was his brother's hand, weak and slanting, written 3 nights before the end, and witnessed at the bottom by the village apothecary and the curate of the parish, which made it, though small, a thing the law would honor. It was a codicil to the will. Edmund had written that the household, in the event of his death, had shown its true face to a young woman named Eleanor Frost, a gentlewoman by birth fallen on hard times, who had given him the only honest companionship of his last illness, and had asked nothing in return, and that he had watched the family treat her as nothing, and had not had the strength to stop it while he lived. He directed, therefore, that she be provided for. He left her a competence of £400 a year, a sum that made her independent of any service forever. And he had added, in a final line, that Theodore read twice, a line that was not a legal instruction, but a brother's last word to a brother, that Theodore should look at the woman the house had taught itself not to see, and ask himself why a dying man had trusted her with everything, and trust his own eyes for once instead of his guilt. The dowager rose from her chair. She had gone white, and the polished courtesy had cracked, and she said the document was surely false, surely a forgery, surely the work of a scheming. The word died in her mouth. Theodore turned and looked at her, and he did not raise his voice, because the men who command best have never needed to. And into the held breath of that hall he spoke, the calibrated thing, the irrevocable thing, the single short sentence that ended the dowager's reign over the house and over the woman in the gray gown in one stroke. Miss Frost stays, she leaves, as my wife or not at all. The silence after the line was a physical thing. Miss Vane's fan stopped moving. The housekeeper set down the tray, with the snuff box on it very carefully, as though it had become hot. The dowager's hand found the back of the chair and held it. and the 2 footmen at the door, who were servants and had watched the quiet one carry coal up 4 flights every winter morning for 3 years, looked at one another, and the elder of them, a gray man named Pruitt, who had served the house since before the dowager came to it, said into the silence, not loudly, that he had never in his life known Frost to take so much as a crust that was not hers, and the younger footman said the same. And it was the smallest mutiny imaginable, and it was enough. The crowd that had been arranged to witness her disgrace had become the crowd that witnessed her vindication, in the same hall, under the same windows, and the verdict had been overturned in front of the very people who had been brought to ratify it. The dowager left Ashbourne within the month, not in disgrace, for Theodore was not a cruel man and would not match her cruelty with his own, but quietly, to the dower house at the edge of the estate that had always been intended for her, with her consequence intact and her power gone. Miss Vane departed for London, and a more cooperative suitor, and bore Eleanor, in the end, no lasting grudge, having never wanted Ashbourne so much as she had wanted to be wanted, which is a different hunger and one Eleanor understood. The apothecary and the curate confirmed the codicil before the family solicitor, a dry, careful man who pronounced it sound in every particular, and the £400 a year was settled on Eleanor absolutely. So that when she became the Duchess of Ashbourne in the spring, she came to it, not as a rescued servant, but as a gentlewoman of independent means, who had chosen freely the man who had finally chosen her. But all of that was the public reckoning, and the public reckoning is not where this story chose to end. It ended in the Long Gallery, the following winter. On the first night the snow came down in earnest. The lamps were lit.
The fire!
The boy Henry, who spoke now, and laughed sometimes, and who had been told that morning he would not be sent away to be made sensible but would stay at Ashbourne always, sat on the hearthrug working a puzzle of wooden blocks his guardian had given him. Theodore stood at the window, watching the snow come down over the grounds, his hand resting on the back of his wife's chair, and Eleanor sat in the warm lamplight, with her father's Virgil open in her lap, the one book she had not had to sell after all, because the dead Duke had bought it quietly at the village sale that first year, and kept it for her without ever saying so, and it had been found among his things, and given to her, with the rest. She was not reading it. She had it open to the page her father had loved, and her hand lay flat upon the page the way a hand lies on something it has come home to. And across the room the boy laughed at his blocks, and the snow came down, and the fire held the dark away from all 3 of them. Theodore said her name, only that the way he had said it the first time in the cold study. She looked up. Outside the glass the snow went on falling over the house that had once decided it had no use for her, and could not now imagine itself without her, and she closed the book gently over her father's page, and held it against her, and that was enough. That was the whole of it. The light did not go out. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If it moved you, leave a word below, and tell me the moment you felt the house begin to turn.